Okay, so to start with middle adulthood, it's really hard to tell. Again, when we start getting into adulthood, what is the transition between young adulthood into middle adulthood and then late adulthood? Um, Probably one of the more difficult transition is between young adulthood and middle adulthood. When do we consider ourselves in this transition period between a youthful adult and an adult within their middle years? Okay. And as the slide says, a variety of human life courses means that individuals can be very different stages of their personal development at age points, such as turning 40. What we have taken as a rough measure of entry to middle adulthood. So when we look at middle adulthood, we usually look at around 35 to 40 years of age is this transition period between young adulthood and middle adulthood. And I think in some ways, this can be a good measure, because if you think about uh, adolescence through young adulthood, what is the goals of young adulthood? Well, one of them is to establish yourself, right? And to establish, in a sense, sometimes your own family unit, whether that's you living in a community with friends and individuals you regularly interact with and take care of together, or whether that's the traditional um, husband, wife, two and a half kids, a dog, and a picket fence kind of analogy. Okay. But also establishing oneself in their career or their career area. Okay. So, and usually that occurs by the age of about 35 or so, when we feel like we have some type of established family. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is what we're seeing developmentally between that kind of psychological maturation that we talked about at the beginning of the class. So psychological maturation being, um, uh, the analogy I used in the beginning of the class is, you're at a shop and you see a shirt that's $50. The only amount of money you have is $50, and let's say this is a Friday, and you have a power bill that is due on Monday that is $50, and you're not going to get paid till that following Friday. Okay. While the psychologically immature mind would go ahead and just buy the shirt and figure out the power bill later. Okay. Psychologically mature mind will withhold gratification, say, I don't need that shirt right now. I need to pay my power bill, and hold off, pay their power bill, and move on. Okay. The withholding of gratification for survival purposes, if you'd like to say. Okay. And we see that on average, that age is around 27. And then there's additional years of maturation. But we also know that there's a gender difference in that. So when we look at genders and defined by individuals' ability to live on their own, take care of themselves, be independent, there's an age gap. Okay, women tend to, on average, be able to do that at around the age of 21. Men currently are around the age of 35. So it kind of makes this range kind of makes sense, where we're going through these maturation stages and becoming independent, being able to withhold gratification for survival purposes, such as having your electricity on, being able to do those things. So that's another way this age might make sense. And then another way is what we're seeing with middle adulthood right now is that we're seeing this ages between 32 to about 40, we see a transition phase. And again, we talked about this at the beginning of the semester, where a lot of theorists believe that we live two lives, as you would say. We lived birth to about age of 35, 40, and then 35 to 40 on. And they're two separate lives, because what we see in these 30s in these later 30s, well, mid to late 30s, is this transition. We're seeing a lot of individuals leave their current work and do something different. We see individuals going back to school and becoming re-educated into something else. We see individuals, divorce rates are really high during this period, and family change systems are really high during this period. And so it seems like there's this transition from the way you were living to a different way you're living. Okay. So this is another argument that kind of says roughly 35 to 40 might be a good cutoff for this. Where it may not make sense is in the physical development arena. If you think about what we've talked about psychological arena, the social arena, but what about the biological arena? Well, we know that individuals age differently physically, okay? And there's some people in their 40s and in their 50s who are just as fit as they were in their 20s and 30s. And we see some people who were very unhealthy in their youth become very youthfully, physically healthy in their middle years. So the area that might not fit this so well is physical health. Okay. So we do know that during this period there are changes that start to occur. I see Facebook memes all the time about when a person turns 40, there's all of a sudden these weird pains and these strange things that the ailments that don't really ever exist start to exist. And some of this has to do with some physical changes we start to see in midlife, okay, both internally and externally. So external changes, we see gray hair start, hair thinning, increased wrinkles in the face, the tendency to put on weight around the waist and lower body. And this has a lot to do with the elasticity of our skin, okay? So around the age of 34, the human body starts to lose elasticity, meaning that when you gain and lose weight, your skin and your muscles have a harder time conforming to that weight gain and that weight loss. Okay. And this is why, around the age of 35 and 40, if you're one of those individuals who loses a lot of weight, you end up with a lot of excess skin around your midsection and all those kinds of things, is because around this time, elasticity starts to wither. And this is also what creates the facial wrinkles, because your skin no longer naturally tightens to changes in face and whatnot. Okay. And then there's some internal changes that include reduction in efficiency in cardiovascular, respiratory, and nervous systems. And this is where a lot of complaints starting in the 40s, start feeling less circulation, more nerve pain, those kind of things. In a way, these tend to be consequences of the youth that you had. We find that individuals who work their bodies really hard in their youth tend to have more cardiovascular, respiratory, and nervous system problems in their middle years. So this is a direct association with how the body is treated in younger phases of development. Okay. And then we know that there's sensory changes such as presbyopia, and loss of hearing, particularly sensitive to higher frequencies and sounds. So if you know a lot of individuals who are in their middle ages and they're around infants and those kinds of things, they become more quickly irritated to infant cries. And this isn't necessarily because they're jerks. It's more that this hearing system has become much, much more sensitive to those higher frequencies that in our youth, we really didn't notice as much. So, and this is why middle age and up tend to get a little bit more irritated quicker when, for example, they hear an infant cry or they hear high-pitched noises, such as, those kind of high pitches that are associated with like hard rock or heavy metal type of sounds. Okay. Text as it appears to a middle adult age with presbyopia. So this is sight issues that we start to see common to develop an adult of life holding printed material. You have to hold it further away or closer. And this is kind of the most likely explanation. So what this print kind of shows is starts to show a very common sight difficulties among individuals with middle age. And what really is starting to happen with the eye is, again, around the age of 34, 35, when we're losing our skin elasticity, our eye, especially our lens of our eye, starts to harden. And then that makes it harder for it to focus in and out on objects. So that hardening of the lens and the cornea around it is what kind of starts to create these kind of visual difficulties that is common, not in all. I want to make this clear. This isn't a dread thing, but it is very common. And when we're talking about common, we're talking, 25, at least 25% of individuals will start experiencing these at some significant level. Among women, specifically in middle age, we often see the onset of menopause, which is the cessation of menstruation. Basically, what happens during menopause is the female stops producing eggs, and so there's no reason for the menstruational cycle to continue. So they go through this period of adjustment, which includes common levels of physical and psychological discomfort, such as hot flashes, mood changes, loss in libido, and insomnia. And what is occurring during this period is, if you think about it, the menstruation process really relies on the female hormones interacting with the body. And with the loss of menstruation, what we see is a reduction or a sudden increase to try and create menstruation of these different female hormones. And this what really creates a lot of the discomfort, the hot flushes, the mood changes, and those types of things. But the intensity of these symptoms vary. And this is one thing that should be noted is menopausal status is not necessarily a strong predictor of things like psychological distress. That menopause seems to be very varied among the female population. In fact, it doesn't even adhere to the traditional bell curve. Women very randomly have different experiences with that. Some might not even notice it, while others have very extreme reactions. Okay. And this is an important point to be made about the menopausal thing is a lot of times when we see physical changes, such as the onset of puberty, we see it interwoven with psychological changes. So remember, when we were looking at puberty is not necessarily predicted by biology itself. It's predicted by a person's psychological state, whether they live in a rural or urban place, whether they have a emotionally supportive mother, whether they have a father in their life, and all those other psychological factors play a role in when an individual will go through, for example, puberty. Menopause, on the other hand, is something that is triggered by the loss of the biological egg. So it is something separate from a psychological change. However, what we do see because of the hormonal changes is this is one instance where our biology is affecting our psychological or mood state. Okay. And so what needs to occur, and this is something to say, is it's not about a change of mind. It's not about, if you're going through mood swings, you need to go have therapy or something. No, there has to be a physical aspect to the experience. Okay. And so with the recommended menopause, instead of focusing on the psychological aspects, more focusing on things like exercise, eating right, those types of things, because it requires a biological response and less of a psychological response, even though, especially women who are going through the extreme difficulties of menopause, it feels like, and I've heard women say this, it feels like they're going crazy, that they can't control it. Okay. But again, this is one of those cases where the biology is really driving what is occurring on the psychological level. All right, so that is physical development. Now let's talk about some of the things dealing with cognitive development. Is what we do find on the cognitive level in middle adulthood is our cognition stays relatively stable. We're not necessarily having rapid gains in cognition like we do with early childhood and adolescence. We're not seeing any rapid losses like what we will see in later adulthood. It tends to be pretty stable. And in fact, as this states, most measures of middle-aged adults perform as well, or if not slightly better than younger adults, because there is that stability of cognition. People tend to trust their judgments a little bit better. As far as skills, we see that real-world tests relate practical application of reasoning, such as how to deal with faulty purchases, flooding a basement, and middle-aged people score significantly higher on these more practical-based skills of living than, for example, younger adults. And other research, however, found that a number of solutions people generate is a response to everyday practical problem peak at middle age. So one of the things that we know about individuals in their middle age is the number of solutions, the number of problems to solutions increases and peaks in middle age and then starts to decline after that. Usually what we see in young adulthood is one or two solutions, where middle adulthood, maybe we see five, and then as we age, it reduces back to one or two. Emotions and clear thinking. Some research argues that there is important reorganization of thinking in middle adulthood as people achieve an integration of information processes and emotional regulation. Okay. And what really this research finds is that in middle adulthood, we have a clearer sense of who we are. We've had all of these life experiences, school, family raising, childhood, adolescence, and stuff like that. And we see a more integration between how we process information and how emotions play a role in that. Okay. Where younger participants tend to sway by their own emotions in conflict situations, while middle adult age participant appear to integrate emotional understanding with other problem solving skills. And this goes back to what we were talking about with, hold on just a second. What we were talking about with emotional intelligence. Again, the basic definition of emotional intelligence is going into a situation and understanding your own emotional response, being correctly able to identify the emotional responses of others, and providing a proper response based on the information of the emotional states you have about each individual. And we see that during middle adulthood, this is kind of where that type of intelligence peaks and where it's most measured at a higher levels, whereas younger participants tend to go with that initial emotion instead of integrating those with practical problem solving skills. And again, I want to bring this up when we're talking about these things. This is on average. that we see these kinds of things. When we look at social and emotional type of development, we see that each phase of life brings new challenges, of course. And for midlife brings multiplicity of them from all quarters of life. Okay. By this time, we have histories are very varied. So we pin down a particular pattern of social emotional development associated with middle adulthood. Okay. And I think that should say we can't. Let me look at this. Yeah, so when we look at socio-emotional development during this period, and we look at it, we see that they can be more emotionally competent, right? But we can't see any particular uh, pattern that is associated with it, because our histories, our emotional history, our explicit history is so varied by this time that there really is no consistent patterns that we see. We do know that, if we look at, for example, theory by Erik Erikson, he noted this period was a period of generivity. The feeling in midlife that one has made is making contribution to the next generation, for example. And the link between generations maintains that, as Erikson says, is a indispensable for renewal of adult generation's own life as it is to the next generation. So this is where, again, generivity has to do with how was my life, and a feeling of needing to come back, but also trying to connect the younger generation with what needs to happen, and so caring for them becomes important. I think this is also during this period we also see the fruits of our labors, for example, right? So middle adulthood usually has, as they get older, tend to have children who start, into middle, high school, college, those types of things. And you start to see, okay, this is what my production is, okay? And I think this is also why we get into some of these generational things, like, the younger generation is this, the older generation is this, because we have that cognitive dissonance because of what we expected the younger generation to be and who they are. That creates dissonance, which then you have to reconcile with, okay? And so sometimes it has negative consequences as well. Erikson argued that there's an important link between the generations, enabling older generations to contribute skills and knowledge to the younger ones. And this is the process of generivity, okay? And then there's the opposite part of that, which is that stagnation point, is the opposing feelings have achieved relative little or have little to offer the next generation. Some people in midlife, for example, conclude that they have not met the family or occupational goals that once motivated them, and some respond in a sense of standing still, or a period of self-absorption. This is at the beginning of the semester I mentioned about how they go and they buy the sports car and do those things that are very self-centered, and an acute awareness that time is limited. And so they feel like they need to get everything in before it all ends. And in some cases, we're likely to experience both generivity and stagnation. And I think this is a core conflict that many people in middle adulthood need to resolve. Is those who resolve it are successfully attain a sense of care about both the present and future, and those who fail to do so develop a sense of rejectivity. They turn away from society and have little interest to contribute to it. So what Erikson is kind of saying here is, again, we're looking at this other generation and saying, hey, have I done something? Have I accomplished something? And in some areas we'll go, yes, I have. And in some areas, we'll say, no, we haven't. Um, when you get to this age, you look at your children and you see some of your children more successfully and some of your children struggling. And so part of them, you're feeling some generivity. Others, you're feeling some stagnation. Where did I go wrong? And you have to resolve those things. Okay. And if you don't, you kind of start to kind of turn away from society. I know some of my peers, because I'm in this age group, who look at their children. I've seen some individuals that feel this rejectivity, and they turn to things like alcohol, they turn to substance abuse, they almost become social phobics, where they don't like going out anymore and they don't like getting out there. And so I kind of have seen this as they evaluate what they've done with their own children and how successful their children are compared to what they expected them to be when they first started having a family. Now, remember, this has to do with what your expectations were when you first started having children. And some individuals don't have high expectations. Sometimes they have a child purely out of just coincidence and don't put any thought about it. They just have that child and they need to care for it. Okay. So what this has to do with is the expectations you had at your youth, when you first started your family. Are they being met in middle adulthood? And if there's a deviation between the two, that's where we go through this process of either care or rejectivity. Okay. Um, and this slide really speaks to, if you remember, I talked about that transition period where a lot of individuals, I would argue, okay, 35 to 45 go through this. I don't like my job. I'm not happy with my family. I need something different, and they go through this transition. This has been popularly known as a midlife crisis. However, I think this needs to be reassessed, in that a lot of individuals through this period are just going through this evaluation period of, am I really happy? This inner conflict of, am I really achieving what I wanted to achieve in life? And a lot of individuals see things that they want to change. So a lot of individuals, this is where we see a lot of individuals who come back to school to go from engineering to social work, for example, and wanting to make some type of change that they've always wanted to make. But subsequent research oversimplified to assume that everybody undergoes a midlife crisis. Okay, so, and this is something that needs to be stated, because there are individuals who simply go through this kind of period and say, I'm happy with where I'm at. So the idea that everybody goes through this quote unquote midlife crisis, I rather call it a midlife transition. There are individuals who don't. And so, and this suggests, this is just one example. Periods of turbulence and self-doubt can be experienced by adults most ages, and some individuals, especially those who score high in, for example, narcissism, may be prone to develop these kind of crises at these ages. Okay. In a large sample, for example, only a minority of middle-aged people feel they experience this crisis, and substantial proportions of middle-aged people report better mental health and self-esteem during this phase in life. Now, this was 1978, and again, when we go back to the beginning of the course, we're seeing that over these generations since Levison's studies, that we're seeing more dysfunction among this age group when we compare it to younger age groups. So this is kind of a change that we are seeing. But traditionally, what we have seen is heightened and better mental health and better self-esteem. But we're seeing some what we think might be cohort cohort changes that we're seeing in our current time. There is no doubt that there is pressure during middle age. And I think and a lot of changes in the domestic world and the world of work. And you know what, gang, I think, and what I want to do here, and I don't have the video with me, is before we move on, I kind of want to stop here, and so that we can have a better conversation this Wednesday in integrating the rest of the information with a video that I want to play, but I don't have that video available with me right at this moment. So I do want to just end today's class. So I'm going to stop.